Hey guys, welcome back. So today we are working on a 1959 Tin Lizzie. This machine was dropped off by a subscriber, John, who's actually owned this since new. His dad gave it to him when he was 5 years old. He enjoyed it quite a bit while growing up, and well, he's never let go of it. Despite its age of 66 years, it's actually in very good condition. That said, though, it is in a disassembled state. We have the original 1959 Briggs engine right here. I believe it's rated at 3 horsepower. And this, as well as the rest of the machine, was actually taken apart 30 years ago. John had plans to refinish it, and while that unfortunately never happened, but now he's looking to get it put back together and back on the road. So that is going to be the goal today. Now, I'm told the engine was in good running condition 30 years ago when this was last fired up. So my hope is that it still runs like it should, but I think we need to start there. So let me get you set up a little bit better and get going on this. So I have to admit, I did cheat a little bit. John dropped this off yesterday. After he left, I put my thumb over the spark plug hole and rotated the flywheel looking for compression. And unfortunately, there is none. So yeah, compression, I didn't think was going to be the problem here. I mean, this is a points and condenser ignition system. I'm sure spark is an issue as well, but without compression, this engine has no chance of running. So I'm thinking, let's get this out of the box. I do want to get this mounted to the Tin Lizzie just so we have a nice stable platform holding the engine still. And then we'll do some more testing, see if we can't figure out why this engine has no compression. So I can tell already this is going to be a challenge. This machine was taken apart 30 years ago and not by me. So I'm not sure exactly what hardware goes where. These look like engine mount bolts. I think they're for the front mounts, but I'm not sure where those are. So let's get the front ones attached and see if we can scrounge up something for the back. Well, given it's been 30 years since this has ran, I'm going to add a little bit of penetrating oil here to the top end, and we'll put a little bit of Marvel Mystery in as well. And we also have a love note here. There is no oil in the engine, so before going any further, I'm going to fill that engine up with some oil. And yeah, still no compression. So even after adding all that oil into the cylinder, it didn't make any difference. So, I don't think it's going to be a problem with the rings. And I did see the piston going up and down. So likely it is a valve problem, but let's just make sure. I'm going to get the starter recoil on. We'll get the compression tester in there and see what that tells us. So before I get the blower housing on, I just wanted to show you an issue with this coil. The wire that connects to the spark plug, it looks like it's pulled out of the coil. You can actually see some wires right there. So even if the points and condenser work, I think there is a good chance that we're going to have a problem with that coil. I don't think this actually is going to fit. We have this mount here in the way, so yeah, unfortunately, I got to pull the engine mounts back off to get that on. And if I'm going to do that, I'm thinking I might just spin the engine around. It's supposed to be mounted in this way, but since I think we have a valve problem, it would be better if the valve cover was facing us rather than the back of the seat. It looks like I can't install the engine any other way except the correct way. So we'll get the blower housing back on, I'll drop the bolts back in, and then we can do the compression test. So let's see what we have for compression. It didn't feel like anything, but I've been wrong before. The gauge should tell us 100% where we're at. So we're starting at 0 PSI, and on an engine like this, there should be a type of decompression system. So if everything's working right, about 60 PSI is what we should see. In this case, I'd be surprised if that needle moved at all. And yeah, we have absolutely no compression. Well, no big surprise. I didn't think we were going to have any. Let's check for spark while we're here. So we use the spark tester and a new plug. So I want to see the light up. And assuming it does, we should also see spark jumping that gap. Wow, good spark. Yeah, very strong spark, both at the plug as well as the tester. So that is surprising. I figured spark was going to be an issue, but it looks like we're good to go as far as spark goes. Well, according to John, this machine I don't think has ever been opened up. And at 66 years old, that's a pretty good record. But, I think today's the day. Without compression, this is not going to run. And most likely, it is a stuck valve. So we need to, at a minimum, get the head off the engine. So I'm going to take a second off camera. We'll just pull the starter recoil off the machine again. We'll get the head bolts removed and the head off the machine. And hopefully that sheds a bit of light on what's going on here. I was able to turn this around and got a couple of engine mount bolts in. So we have a nice solid mounted engine to work with. And in this configuration, we now have access to the head bolts, the carburetor, as well as the valve cover. Bolts are fairly loose, but this head doesn't get torqued down that high either. I think it's only about 140 inch-pounds. Okay, well that came off way too easy. The head doesn't look that bad, just a little bit of carbon on there. And I see that currently the intake valve is open. So let's rotate the engine. Now the exhaust is opening. And yeah, that intake valve is not moving at all. So I think if we just keep going here until the exhaust is open, We should be able to push this down or tap it down. But let's spray a little bit of penetrating oil in there first. That is really stuck. So tap it lightly, but I don't want to cause any damage here. Okay, well, it closed. And it's open again. So that's good, though, that it moved. I'm going to get a little more penetrating oil in there, and we'll just do that a few more times until the valve starts moving on its own. Yeah, that valve's pretty stuck, so I think the best course of action here is going to be to actually get the valve cover off and try to get the valve out completely. Before I try to do that, though, I'm going to work it a bit more because as it is right now, it's so tight, I'm not sure I could even get it out by hand. So, yeah, we'll do this a few more times, and then I think we'll get the carb out of the way, get the valve cover off, and release the valve from the retainer so that we can remove it from the engine. All right, we're making progress, so I can now push the valve down just with my hand. So let's try that again. Okay, good. Definitely feels pretty gummy, and that coil is sparking. I just felt it through my finger, so yeah, we got a good coil. And I think the engine's going to come around. Yeah, that time it almost closed on its own. Yeah, it's dropping down now on its own. A little delayed, but it is dropping down. Okay, good. Let's get the carb out of the way. We'll get the valve cover off, and we'll just get both valves off. We'll clean them up properly, as well as clean the surface. And I think we're going to be able to get this engine back together. Man, that is a petrified fuel line. So when they're like that, they don't like coming off the barb. So I think we'll just cut it with the utility knife. And when we put this back together, we'll just throw a new fuel line in its place. Yeah, we're hung up on a, looks like a linkage here to the air vane governor. There we go. And just 2 screws here on the valve cover. And the valve cover came off pretty easily, but the gasket is torn. So we're going to need a new one of those. I think I do have some. I'm not sure if it fits this size engine, but we'll deal with that when we get to that point. I'm going to check the valve clearance before getting the valves out. I haven't looked up what these should be, but I'm guessing around 6 or 7 thousandths on the intake. And that is a 6 right there. It has a bit of drag. Let's try a 7. And the 7, super tight. So I would say it's around a 6, maybe 6.5. Let's check the intake. That's usually a larger gap on these engines, probably about a 9 or a 10 thousandths of an inch. So we'll start with a 9. And that fits very little drag, so I'm guessing it's probably closer to an 11. And yeah, the 11 feels pretty good. So the valves actually, I don't think need to be adjusted. We just need to get them out, clean them up, and I think we'll be good to go. I'm pretty sure this retainer uses a pin going through the valve stem, so we need to raise it up a little bit, and we have to make sure this is nice and center. Otherwise, we're going to be lifting the pin up as well. So yeah, let's get this in the middle. I think it's right about there, if I can keep it there. Okay, I see the pin. Yeah, that's working. And you can see this is the valve in question, the one that was stuck. Surprisingly, not a lot of rust, but just having that build up in there, it's going to prevent the valve from moving properly. So we do need to clean the valve stem. We also need to clean the guide, at least flush it out. But even with that quick clean, it is already moving quite a bit better. Do a quick check. You know, if it's clean, it should just drop in even without the spring. And that's what it's doing now. Actually, the lifter is preventing it from going all the way down. So if I rotate the engine, you can see it closes and seems to be forming a good seal. Good. So we'll start just by cleaning up the sealing surface here. And these towels, they're just to prevent any debris from going down into the valve guides. We know they already have issues and we just cleaned them out, so I want to keep them clean. And to clean the valves, you just need a drill, a bit of Scotch-Brite, and some WD-40. So we'll start with the problem valve, which is the intake. And just soak this up good. And spin the valve. Okay, we'll do the same for the exhaust. The valves came out pretty good. You know, I don't think they need to be lapped. The face looks pretty good, as well as the seat. But since we're here, I will lap them real quick, just to make sure we get a good seal. And I think you can see we have a good line going all the way around. The valves, they are making good contact. So I'm going to get them reinstalled. So add just a bit of oil and get the springs and retainers back in place. So the trick is to not lose the pin. There's actually a hole right there that goes into the crankcase. So let me stuff a towel in there, because with my luck, I'll drop it and that's exactly where it's gonna go. Yeah, I think that's good. You shouldn't be able to see the pin, if it's centered properly. Initially when I put it in, you could see the pin on the right side. But it looks like we're good now. Let's do the intake. And it looks like included, we do have a gasket kit for the engine. So that has a few things that we need, like the valve cover gasket. Looks like some gaskets for the intake. And I think we have a head gasket in there as well, but I'm going to need 2 hands to get that out. So just get a little bit more oil in here, especially down by the lifters. And we can close it up. So put this down here just to catch a little bit of the mess. And, I was under the impression that this engine hasn't been into before, but this head and really the engine side of things internally, it was just too clean for a 66-year-old machine. So I think it has been opened up at least one point, and I found some other clues on the head bolt. So I'll show you that in a bit. But for now, let's just get this prepped, and then we can get the engine back together. So I think the other clue that someone's been in this engine at some point is the placement of the head bolts. You know, 3 of the bolts are longer than the rest. And usually the longer bolts go around the exhaust valve. But in this case, the 3 longer bolts were actually all up front. So I think what I'm going to do is move that long bolt over to here, and then we'll fill the rest with the shorter ones. And I think another clue here is that some of these bolts are missing washers, and usually all the head bolts have washers. That helps with the torque as far as getting things accurately torqued down. So I'm going to dig up a few washers before installing these head bolts. So this gets torqued to 140 inch-pounds, and I'm going to bring it up to 60 inch-pounds first, and then we'll finish it up at the 140. See if we have compression, and we definitely do. You can see the flywheel is kind of bouncing back, and I can feel it pushing on my thumb. So let's get the compression tester in there once we get the starter recoil back on, and we'll see what the compression's at. All right, let's give this a try. I think we're going to see something a little bit better than 0. So let's give this a few pulls. Yeah, 1 pull, we're already at 70 psi. So let's give that a few more pulls. Yeah, and we're at 100 psi, so this engine should definitely run. So we have compression, we've got spark. What do you suppose the odds are that the carb is clean? Let's take a look. So I'm hoping the carb is good, although when I took it off earlier I tipped it and some fluid came out. So I'm hoping that was just some of the penetrating oil that I sprayed on that intake valve that just worked its way in there. So, you know, it doesn't seem like there's much of anything in there now. So I'm just getting the air cleaner off. This is an oil bath air cleaner, which I took a peek in there earlier. It was actually pretty spotless. So likely this was stored properly. So for the main jet, let's count the amount of turns that it's set at right now. 1/2, 1.5, just over 1 3/4. And that looks pretty clean. And no liquid coming out. So, you know, I think I'm going to give this one the benefit of the doubt. Mostly because I don't have a gasket kit for this. And I'm pretty sure it was stored properly. So I'm going to set this back to where it was. We'll get it back on the machine, and we'll feed it some fuel. See if it fires up. The carb's taking fuel, so that is a good sign. And the flow seems to be slowing, so the needle, I think it's working. So let's give it a pull and see if we can wake this engine up after a 30-year slumber. All right, so let's give this a try. Now, I do have a few concerns here. We are missing some parts. So right now, it's only going to idle. Assuming it starts, I can depress this to speed the engine up. And the other concern is that I have no way to shut this down. There's supposed to be a piece of metal right here to ground the plug out. So if things go wrong, then I might need to pull the wire. Anyway, hopefully they don't go wrong. The throttle plate is not stuck. The air vane governor is not stuck. And that should slow it down. So let's turn the choke on and see what we get. It's trying. And we are dripping fuel, so the needle's not doing so well, so let's try the choke open. Okay, good. So the engine sounds good. I was trying to adjust the idle down a little bit. So let's refuel, get it started again. I want to slow it down and just see how well the engine can run at low speed as well as high speed. So we are refueled, and I actually reset the main jet back to just over 1 3/4. There's actually a pilot jet over here. I completely overlooked that. So that is actually the needle we should be setting right now, while the engine's idling and not under load. The high-speed one we can tweak later once we connect the belt and actually get this thing moving. You gotta love Briggs. I mean, this machine hasn't run in 3 decades. It had no compression, and it was made in 1959, yet with a little bit of love, this came right to life. I adjusted the needles, we got it running pretty well. I could idle it down super slow, and the throttle response seemed pretty good. That said, though, we're not out of the woods yet. After the engine shut down, the carb continued to flood over. So we do need to go through this and likely order some parts. And once we get that squared away, we can get the tank mounted, plumbed in, turn the engine around. We'll add the belt and see if the drive system is still good. So I've got the carb off again. And before I open it up, let's pull the needles. And we'll start just by checking where they're at after we ran it. So this was just over 1 3/4. And right now it is 1.5, 1 3/4, 2, about 2 1/8 for the main jet. And we'll do the same check for the pilot, though a little bit harder to get in here. So with the air filter off, you kind of can get a screwdriver on it, but still not great. And with the air box installed, you can't really get in there at all. So we'll turn this in. There's half. Might be easier with my fingers here. Nope. Yeah, it looks like the pilot was about 1 turn out. So we'll set that back, and I'm sure we'll have to fine tune it regardless once that airbox is back on. And I'm going to leave this intake manifold off. I don't think there's any reason to remove that. And it looks like the pilot jet has a washer on it. Sometimes there's an O-ring, although I'm not seeing it on this one, on either needle. So we just have 4 screws right here, and the top of the carb should lift off. I think before we do that, we need to disconnect the governor spring. And we know the carb can't be too bad. It was running the engine actually pretty well. So if we're lucky, it's just a dirty seat. And I think this seat's also removable, so there's an O-ring as well, which can leak between the seat and the carb body. And of course, the float might have a hole in it as well, so we're going to have to check all of that. Now, I don't have any parts for this carb, so I'm hoping that we don't have to order any. But I think that's going to be unlikely. Yeah, it looks like there's actually a jet in there. So that, although I don't think that's what's holding it on right now because it's not even moving at all. I think even when we break the seal, that needle likely goes through into the top cover as well. So let's try to get that off before trying to separate the halves. Emulsion tube looks pretty clean. So let's see if this will come apart. And that would be a no. There we go. Interesting. So the gasket didn't tear, but it's actually kind of holding the float captive. So looks like the pin is kind of sliding out on its own. So let's get the pin out. And that should at least allow us to split the carb. There we go. Yeah, pretty clean. And I'm happy to say the gasket kind of survived, at least so far. I'm not sure it's going to survive gaining access to that float. So close. But yeah, the gasket, I think it's a goner. But yeah, let's try to not completely destroy it. I assume I can get a new one. I guess worst case, I can make another. But we still need a template to make one of. Interesting. So I'm hoping this piece isn't part of the gasket, but it is stuck to it. So we'll look at that a little closer later. You know, as far as the carb goes, it's in excellent condition. No liquid in the float. The needle also looks pretty good. So yeah, I'm not completely sure why it kept flooding out. But I'm thinking we should do a little bit of testing because I think there is an O-ring underneath the seat. So it could be coming from there versus the needle. So let's get the needle reinstalled, we'll plumb in some fuel and just test it. See if it can hold back the fuel. And if it doesn't, we might be able to tell where it's coming from. So like this, we have a little bit of pressure pushing down on the needle, and the float, the weight of it is holding things closed. And I don't see any signs of a leak, so I'm kind of surprised actually that this flooded over on a couple occasions. So maybe we didn't need to open this. And given how clean it looks, I'd say there really was no reason to open it other than the fact that the needle seemed to be getting hung up. Anyway, I'm going to let this sit upside down for a few minutes and just see if this area remains dry. And if it does, then I think the only thing we need to do is maybe give this a quick clean, get a new gasket, and put this thing back together. Well, it's been about 10 minutes, and the fuel, it hasn't budged. You know, we are nice and dry down by the needle and seat. So, I would say that we don't have an issue, but it doesn't really answer the question why, it flooded over on several occasions. So I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. As far as I can tell, there is nothing wrong here. So, I did go on eBay and I ordered up a new gasket. It'll be here in a couple days. For now, we'll just give this a quick clean and give it a quick soak in the ultrasonic, and we'll set it aside until we get the new gasket. The carb cleaned up pretty well, and I didn't think it was dirty to begin with. I was kind of surprised actually when the ultrasonic turned on just how much dirt came off of this thing. Anyway, we're going to set this aside for a few days until we get the new gasket. So I've got the brakes turned off. The machine now rolls, and you see when it rolls, the pulley is spinning. So it looks like the drive system and the gears should work. And inside this case, I think we just have a chain actually coming down, and it looks like a reduction gear up above. So this case does have oil in it, and I believe it's just gear oil. And there's no drain on it, but we do have a fill. So let's get this off and make sure we have some in there. And I guess regardless, I'm going to try to get out what I can and get some fresh oil in there. And yeah, actually we are full. I can see the oil. Pretty dark though. That might be original oil. So without a drain, there is no great way to get this out. But I do have a fluid extractor that I think I can get in there and at least get most of it out. So I think that's going to take a while. The oil is just really thick for this small tube. So I'm just going to let it do its thing. And I think while it's doing that, I might replace this spring right here. John did include some new springs in one of the boxes. So I've got to imagine it was meant for this, because this spring is pretty mangled. So this is the spring that John included in the box. And it looks to be a pretty good fit. So let's see if we can get this old one out. Might be easier just to cut it out. All right, let's give this a try. I did shorten it by that much. So that should hopefully give us the spring tension we need. So let's try fitting it. Yeah, that feels pretty good. So you need the spring tension to keep kind of this clamped in place. So the way this works, and it will probably become more apparent when I turn the engine around, is that, we have a belt on this pulley, and the pulley is rusty. We actually need to clean that up. And this is what is attached to the engine pulley. Now, there's actually two engine pulleys. So when it's in this position, there's tension on the belt. So the belt is driving the vehicle forward, in this case, counterclockwise. And when you throw the lever, it actually takes the tension off the belt. And there's a second pulley that this friction disc engages. And what that does is it actually reverses the rotation, giving this vehicle reverse. So it's a pretty nice, simple system, really. Anyway, I think we're good, as far as this goes. And the oil did finally drain out, so let's top that off with some new fresh oil. Yeah, we are full. Nice clean oil. I'm just removing these engine mount bolts, and I'm going to turn the engine around, I guess for two reasons. I want to test fit the belt, and I also want to get the fuel tank on there, make sure that that is going to go on without any issues. I've got the engine secured, at least with one bolt on each side, and things are aligned, I think, as good as I can get them. So let's just test it real quick, make sure we can engage drive as well as reverse. All right, so right there, that is drive. Belt tension seems good. Let's try reverse. And yeah, reverse is locked in. So I think that will do. Now, there's also a bracket that came in the box of parts. Let me grab that real quick. And that's the bracket, which I assume goes right there. It seems to be the right shape. And we have a hole right there, but it doesn't quite align. But I think I saw a spacer in that box too. Let me grab that. So that is the spacer right there that was in the box. I wasn't sure what it went to, but I'm thinking it's supposed to go right there. There was also this bolt mixed in with the engine bolts, and it's actually the same thread as right there. So we might be missing a washer. Let me check that box again. And that's the washer right there that was floating around in the box. So there's still a lot of parts I don't know where they go, but we are slowly figuring it out. So you can kind of see the witness mark right there where the washer was. And that seems to be the right size. So let's just test fit everything. Yeah, that looks pretty good. So the drive system, I think it's going to work out. We have all the parts we need. We've got fresh oil, a new spring, and everything that we need seems to be here. So I'm going to take this off for now. And let's get the tank out. Let's test fit that and make sure that's going to work out. So this is the tank that came with the machine. You know, you can tell it's been primed and actually worked on. There are a bunch of patches going around. And on the bottom, there's quite a few more. We have a few patches right here, another patch there, and it looks like a patch right there. So, you know, this tank was full of pinholes, but the tank itself now doesn't look bad. It looks like it has been cleaned up and likely could be used, assuming that it doesn't leak. We do have the hardware to mount this to the top bracket, and there's also a mount here on the bottom, but we're missing that bracket, so we do need to order one of those up. The fuel valve, you know, we have the remnants of one, but this fuel valve probably isn't usable or shouldn't be used because we have a broken filter. So John did order some new parts, including this fitting right here, which seems to have a good filter. And he also ordered the shutoff valve. And the valve does fit and thread in. So I thought we were in good shape, but the thing I'm noticing is that even if I bottom this out all the way, it's not forming a seal. So I double checked the part number versus the parts diagram, and this is the correct part number. But when I pull up a picture of this part, the shutoff valve, it doesn't have a fine point like this one. It actually has a blunt point. So I think someone sent him the wrong part in the right box. So we need to order one of those up. And he also got a barbed fitting, but it's kind of long. So I'm going to get a shorter one, you know, something like that. So, you know, we can't really do much with the tank for now. It's going to take a good week to get those parts. So for now, I'm going to set this aside and we'll move on to something else. So it's going to be at least a week before we get the parts we need to finish up the engine. So while we wait for those parts, I think we should turn our attention to just getting the rest of this machine together. You know, I think starting with the wheels. You know, these are the original wooden spoke wheels. And initially I thought the rims were wood as well, but they're actually metal. That said, though, we're still going to have to be careful. You know, I have a set of 4 new tires as well as tubes. So I'm going to start here with the front left, and assuming that goes well, we'll do the rest. You know, I've got some tire spoons. They might be a little bit overkill for these little wheels, but we'll give it a go. You know, these are essentially bicycle wheels, and they're not that hard to change, but again, I'm just concerned about, you know, the rims. I don't want to damage them. I got to imagine they are very hard to replace. And this is actually proving to be a little bit harder than I thought. You know, I thought this would just kind of fall right off. But that is not the case. All right, we're making progress here. So I'm hoping the new ones go on a little bit easier. That rubber was pretty dry rot and petrified. Didn't have much stretch in it. So yeah, these, I'm gonna venture to say, might go on a little bit easier than they came off. At least that's my hope. Yeah, much easier getting the new one on. So we'll get the tube situated and then finish it up. I was going to say that piece we can screw in and prevent this from falling through, but don't think we can actually spin it. The spokes are too close, so we're just going to have to keep an eye on that and try not to lose the valve stem. So we'll get this tucked in, and I don't have any extra tubes, and I will say, you know, getting a tube installed, there is a risk of puncturing it, you know, if you use tools. So it's always good to have an extra tube, because if you don't have one, chances are you're going to need it. But let's see how we make out with this. If we're lucky, we won't need tools. Yeah, no tools required. Still have the valve stem. Perfect. All right, I'm not sure the best tool I have for this, but trying to get the petrified rubber over the rim, it doesn't work. So we'll start by trying to cut this cord with the wrong tool. In this case, this is for cutting metal, but it does give a lot of leverage. And there are metal cords in there, so that actually may have been the right tool for the job. So the cords are cut, at least on that side. Yeah, that'll do. So we've cut the cord on this side, and we've, you know, taken all the stress out. So this side will come right off with pretty much zero effort. And if we cut the cord on the back side, it should be equally as easy. There we go. So we'll just give this a quick clean. And there are some parts that are missing, you know, some that are broken. You know, John does plan on replacing those parts, but for now he was kind of on the fence. He wanted to see if this was a viable machine, and you know, it's looking like it is. You know, for now we're just going to put on the parts we have, and he can order the missing parts in the future. And the headlight and actually the front bumper are two of the missing parts. Yeah, it's starting to come together. That fender looks pretty nice. And originally I was thinking it just bolted on the bottom here. These bolt holes line up. And for the most part, that works until we get to the very back. It's kind of hard to see on this side, but if you look here, the support for the wheel goes right up to the bottom here. So we can't tuck it under. I think we actually need to put it on top and kind of sandwich it between the lower part of the tub and the upper part. So to get this installed, I think we're actually going to have to remove, you know, the few bolts that we have going around and kind of lift up the tub, slide it under, and then we can bolt it in place. I pulled the fender out as well as the few bolts that were here. So now the upper tub, it is separated from the bottom. So let's try tucking that fender back in. You know, we'll drop some bolts in and tighten it down. So I'm just putting everything in kind of loose right now. You know, I do want to make a trip to the store and get some washers for the bottom side. But for now, we're just kind of test fitting it. You know, I just have a bag of random hardware, so I'm not completely sure what goes where, but, you know, these bolts seem to be fine, other than the fact I think we could just add the washer on the back side. And we also have this metal support for the fiberglass. So there's two bolts that get put in on the bottom of the bucket, and then we have just two more bolts on each side. So let's get this in place, again, loosely, and after making a trip to the store, we'll come back and finish this up. It's cleaning up really nice. Anyway, it is the next day. I did make a trip to the store and got the washers I needed. So this fender, it's been cleaned up and secured. It is 100%. And I also installed the one on the other side. it also cleaned up pretty well. But it is not perfect. You know, this was crashed, I would say, at some point. We are missing the tip of the fender right here. And I'm guessing it was the same crash that took out this light. Anyway, not much more to do now, but we do need a seat. You know, there's not one in here right now. So, you know, John did include the original seat. Yeah, it is pretty dirty, and it has, you know, a bunch of rips kind of going around. So, you know, ultimately, I think this is going to have to be reupholstered. But for now, you know, it is perfectly usable. So let's clean this up and get it installed. I've taken this just about as far as I can, at least until we get the engine parts. That said, though, there is still one big piece of the puzzle, and that is the throttle control. We have two levers here in the steering column. The one on the left is just for show, but the one on the right, you know, we can actually connect a cable to. So the plan was to use the choke cable, you know, connect that up, and then that is routed down and out through the side of the tub here. There is a cutout for it, and then we can route it right to the engine. I guess the hang up with this approach is that the wire inside this cable, although it's kind of the standard size, the diameter is too large, and it does not fit onto the governor control. It's that little hole right there next to the spring is where we need to connect to. So that measures about 44 thousandths of an inch, and this cable is about 55 thousandths of an inch. So I ran to the small engine shop, see if they had any alternatives, and unfortunately everything they had was pretty much the same diameter as this cable. So I think what I'm going to do instead is pull out that cable and use this in its place. This just came from the hardware store. This is stainless steel wire that is 1 millimeter in diameter, which is almost exactly the size we need. So yeah, let's get the wire out that's not going to fit. You know, we'll cut this outer cable to length and get it mounted up, and we'll feed this through and just kind of mock things up, see if this is gonna work. So we'll start just by getting this wire out. And the only thing we're going to keep here is the outer sleeve. You know, we don't want this piece at all, so I'm going to start by cutting that off. And then we'll put it back on the cart, just find out the exact length that we need and make the final cut. All right, let's get this fitted. We just have a clamp right here to hold the sleeve in place. So it goes under this plate, and we drop the screw in and snug it up. So we've got the cable successfully routed, and the tie down for the cable is right here on the engine. I know it's probably hard to see, so we want to cut it just about at that length, not too short, but not too long. That way we'll have a little bit of adjustment up and down as needed. So right about where I made the mark, I actually might make it just a touch longer, because you can always take more material off, but you can't put it back on. Okay, good. We're through. So I'm going to cut this side short, probably put a Z-bend in it, and we'll test connecting it to the throttle lever and just make sure that it can handle it. So I'm just going to make a Z-bend on this side of the wire. This is the side that connects to the column. The engine side I'm not going to touch. At least not yet. You know, I want to get it installed and the carburetor back connected before, you know, finalizing that. 'Cause the governor linkage right now and the governor spring, they're not on the engine. So until that's installed, you know, we can't do the engine side of things. So the way the cable mounts is that it has to come in this way under this plate. And the cable is actually sandwiched in. At that point, you can't really move it around, which is a problem because the Z-bend, you need to install the cable at a 90-degree angle and then set it down to the final angle. So that is not an option here. Luckily though, the plate, it's just held on by a nut. So if we loosen that, we can actually remove the plate, install the cable, clamp it down, and then install the plate kind of after the fact. And at that point, we should have a working throttle control. Perfect. Well, I thought we were home free, but the cable, or the wire I should say, ended up bending. So it's just too thin. You know, it's not up to the task. So I'm going to put the larger diameter cable in there. And I haven't quite figured out yet how I'm going to connect it to the engine, but I think given this problem right here, we have no choice. You know, this wire, it's too thin. And we can't go any bigger without having issues on the engine side, but I think that is the only option we have at this point. And this wire is much stronger. So even though it's only a few thousandths thicker diameter, whatever material this is, definitely more rigid than that stainless steel wire I was using. Can't argue with that. Much better. All right, so we finally have the gasket we need to get this carb back together. So that gasket has to go on first. And then the needle and float. Okay. And we can get the bowl on next. And don't forget this piece. And we'll get the emulsion tube back in. And technically that is the main jet, but it is metered by the needle. So this is essentially how you control the fuel flow. You drive it all the way in, there's no flow at all. And of course, the further you back it out, you know, this is a cone shape. So the further it goes out, the more fuel is allowed in. All right, that's been snugged up. And the main jet, it has an O-ring and a washer. So the O-ring goes against the car body and the washer toward the spring. And right there, we're bottomed out. So I think we were at 2 and about 1/8. Something like that. And lastly, we have the pilot, which I didn't see a washer or an O-ring on this one. Sometimes they do have them. So we'll get that bottomed out, and then we'll just back it out one turn. All right, feels bottomed out there. And this one, not a straight shot. So there's half. One. So that should do it as far as the carb goes. But let's actually bench test it. We'll get some fuel in it and just let it sit. Make sure the needle and seat are working as they should. And we're advancing very slowly, so I'm not too concerned about that yet. You know, as more fuel is allowed in, you know, that float pushes up harder to form a seal. And, you know, at this point, it's hardly moving, if at all. So that should be good, but I'm going to let it sit for 10 minutes and we'll just make sure, because, you know, when it flooded out on me a couple times, you know, it was pouring out of the bottom. It wasn't like a slow leak. So that needle was completely stuck, but it does look like it's holding. So yeah, we'll check back on that in a bit. Well, that didn't take long. It's been about a minute, and we're actually leaking from the main jet, so that O-ring likely is no longer good, although it was still flexible. So, you know, potentially I could reseat it. You know, I do also have some other O-rings that are fuel rated, so if one of these fit, you know, I'll swap it out. Otherwise, we'll try to reseat that. So that O-ring actually seems to be a pretty good fit. So I'm going to get this one off. This one isn't terrible. You know, it's not petrified. It still moves. So, you know, potentially we might have to revert to that. I guess it depends on, I would say, the inner diameter of this one. Yeah, that one, a little bit loose. So I don't think that's going to work. So let's give this one more try. I think we're going to likely have to order a new one. And actually, I do have a parts carb for this. That was something John included in one of the boxes. So if this still leaks, I might try, you know, the O-ring that's on that carb if it's still there. And I can see a puddle forming already. So yeah, let me check the parts carb, see what that has to offer. So we'll set this aside for now. We'll come back to that in a second. And this is one of several boxes that came with this cart. And this one has a lot of carb parts in it. Although I'm not seeing a main jet. But there is also the carb body. Let me check that. And no, it's missing the main jet. And this carb actually looks a little bit different. You know, this seems to be the original. We have external threads here, whereas the carb we're using now has internal threads. So I don't think it would have been compatible anyway. So I'm thinking for now, we'll run with this. You know, this is an easy thing to swap out, but it is going to take another week to get another O-ring. But as it is, it's not really that much danger, but of course you don't want to run like that indefinitely. So yeah, overall though, not too bad. I think this carb will come around once we get the part. Actually, I think we might be in business here. I gave the old gasket one more try, and it's been about 5 minutes now, and there is no leaking from that main jet. So, I don't know if potentially, the gasket just wasn't seated right, or maybe it is suspect. Either way, I am going to order another one just in case. But for now, I think we're good. So I pulled the engine off again. There's one major thing we need to take a look at, and that's how to shut the engine down. Originally this would have had a metal tab that you just bend over to ground out the secondary, and I was planning to add that back. But John did mention his grandkids are going to drive this, and he actually wants a switch inside the vehicle so they can shut the engine down. So to do that, we have to run a wire from the points to a switch in the passenger seat. So we can do that, but I'm thinking while we're here, let's try converting this to electronic ignition. This coil is very suspect, and of course points on something that sits around, can be a bit finicky. So ideally, we wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. So this coil, it is compatible with this engine starting in 1962. And this engine is 59, so I don't know if this is going to work. It is the correct diameter, and it looks like the bolts will align. So I think this will work, but I do have some reservations because the 62 version of this engine actually has a different flywheel with a different part number. So I'm not sure if that is going to cause an issue with getting something like this working. So I'm thinking for now, I'm not going to uninstall the coil completely. If I don't have to, I'm just going to remove these bolts, try to move it out of the way. We'll make sure this one mounts up, that we can gap it properly, and that we have spark. And if we do, then we can eliminate this coil and actually just run the switch off this tab right here. So this one is labeled cylinder side. It's hard to tell, but I think the bolt holes align. Yeah, and it looks like we can gap it properly. So this, I think, is going to work out. So let's gap this. We'll just spin the engine, make sure we have spark. So I'm just going to get this plug out so there's no compression fighting us. And I'm going to spin the engine. Hopefully we see some spark, but I'm not sure if I can spin this with a socket. Although, I do have a removal tool, so I guess I could probably spin it with that. So yeah, let me get you a little bit better situated. And maybe we'll add the spark tester. That'll be a little easier for everyone to see. So I'm going to spin it with the drill. Hopefully we see something here. And no. There's no spark, so I'm guessing the magnet polarity on the flywheel is kind of opposite than what's expected. So I'm going to flip the coil upside down so that the cylinder side is actually facing out, and we'll try this again. I can tell you already, this is going to be a problem. So if we do have spark this way, you know, the governor is right there. So, I mean, I guess we could probably bend the wire at a sharp turn. But that could be a problem. So we'll do the same test. This time the coil is reversed. And no, fortunately, we're not going to get electronic ignition, at least not with the flywheel that's on there now. So I'm going to put the original coil back on, and I'm going to pull the flywheel off. We need to hook up a wire to kill the engine from the driver's seat. So usually I would pull a flywheel off, but this one has no accommodations for a puller. So, you know, I could get actually the big puller that has big jaws, and I might try that because what I'm worried about is if I hit the end here, even with a brass hammer, you know, I could mushroom this, and then the starter clutch isn't going to slide in place. So yeah, let's try the puller first. You know, I'm hoping this flywheel isn't too stuck on there, but yeah, given its age, it's probably going to be stuck. Nope, this one's too small. Yeah, I think this one's going to be too big. At least these jaws are there, almost half an inch thick. I can get two of them on. But not the third. And without the third, you know, it's not going to work. So yeah, the puller, not an option. So I'm going to resort to kind of my least favorite plan, but I'll give it a couple light taps and see if we make any progress here. I think we just got lucky on this one. Good. So to do this, we're going to have to add another wire right here. Currently, there's only one. That is the wire that runs up to the coil. And by removing the condenser, we're going to have to reset the gap, which is fine, but you really need to remove it in order to add the second wire, which is going to go to the kill switch. So we'll pull this out. There is a little bit of extra wire tucked in here, so we have a little bit of slack. And there is some silicone or RTV. We're actually going to have to clean that out as well, because as it is, we can't actually run a second wire through there. So I guess we'll worry about that in a second. Now, to free this wire, you do need a special tool that comes with a new points and condenser. Thankfully, I found this in one of the boxes that came with this. So by pushing this down, you're pushing the spring, and that's going to release the one wire that's in there right now, and that wire runs up to the coil. So what we want to do is just to add a second wire to that. And that one, if you ground it out, will kill spark. So this is a really strong spring too. If you don't have this tool, I'm not sure you're going to be able to do it. So that is going to be the kill wire. And we'll try to feed the coil wire in next. And I think that'll do. So let's see if we can get both wires through here. And I'm going to have to double check the gap on this. I think it's about 18 thousandths of an inch. So we'll set it at that. And I'll just double check it before closing it up. So right now the points, I think we're open. So we'll slide that up until it makes contact. And we'll snug the bolt down. And then we'll rotate the engine. And just double check it. It feels a little loose at 18. The official spec is 20, so let's check it at 20. Yeah, it's right there. So I think we're good. Yep, we're good. So let's try this out real quick. Make sure we still have spark. And we do. And then if we take this new wire we added and just ground it out and rotate the engine, we should not see spark anymore, and we don't. until we pull the wire out. And now we have spark back. So this wire we will extend to a switch, and it looks like it's going to do what we need it to. And we'll add this protective screen back. I think the real purpose is to keep debris from running through the engine and getting stuck in the fins, but it also helps if someone sticks their fingers in there. Now, I only have 2 of the bolts, which I don't think will be a problem. I mean, ideally we'd have all 4, but I'd rather, try to run this as is than not run it at all. So we have everything now we need to get this tank back together. Now, I actually did find, after digging through some boxes, the barb I was thinking about. I did order one anyway, because I didn't see that till after. And actually the same thing for this valve. There was a parts box which contained the parts for a carburetor, and it actually had the correct valve. So this one, I tested it. It works fine. But we also have a new one, so we'll get that one installed. So let's get out this old adapter here, and we'll put in the new. I am going to use a bit of thread sealant. This is fuel rated, and there's not a lot of threads there, and they are painted, so I'm a little bit concerned that it might leak. Also, this tank has not been tested since it was patched, so it might leak anyway, even if the fittings are good. So we're not going to put too much fuel in it to start with. And usually I don't use sealant on these, but this tank, I think it's going to need all the help it can get. Well, so far so good. We don't have any leaks on the bottom of the tank, and the valve also looks nice and dry. So let's just test that it functions. And yeah, nice good flow. So the tank, I think, is good. Yeah, I may have spoken too soon. Although the underside looks good and the valve seems to be working as it should, we do have a leak right here. There's a little pinhole leak, and it's actually washing the paint off. So you can see the original brown underneath. So we do need to patch at least one more spot. And there's actually a few other rough spots here. So I'm not sure if, those are other pinholes just waiting to come through. Regardless, though, we know we have one. So I'm going to drain the fuel out. And I'm going to pick up some probably tank weld and just putty it on like he did on the other holes. And in a day or so, we should be good to go. So even though we're leaking from the tank, there's nothing stopping us from getting the carb reinstalled. But I just wanted to kind of show you how I was going to control the throttle, because once this is mounted, I'm not going to be able to show you how I connected the throttle up. But this clamp is what's going to hold the outer sleeve, and the wire is going to come up. And ideally, it would attach to this piece right here, but it's not possible given the diameter of these holes. And actually, this whole piece really isn't necessary. This is for controlling the throttle up above on top of the engine, which we don't need at all. The sole purpose of this, really, in this application is just being able to push down to manually throttle the engine. But since we're going to have it connected to the car, we don't need that. We can actually connect the wire either directly to the spring, or I can make some sort of adapter to connect the wire. So yeah, I'm going to try to do that. If that doesn't work out, then I will just connect the wire from the throttle directly to that spring. I'm going to install a new piece of fuel line. And my hope was to run it around the front of the machine, but I can't really do that because the barb on the carb faces the back and it goes right under the exhaust. So it's kind of unavoidable. And we also have the pulley to contend with. So when I do the final install here, I'm going to have to be kind of aware of where the fuel line is and just make sure it's not going to get caught up in the belt or touch the exhaust. Yeah, definitely not the best routing. So, worst case, I can probably find some way to secure it. Potentially I could use one of these crankcase bolts and a hook. And actually that might be the way to go here, but I'm going to wait until it's installed back where it belongs just to see if there's any other options as far as how to secure this out of the way. And of course we can't go up or we're never going to get the fuel out of the bottom of the tank. So we do have to keep it low. Anyway, let's get the clamp on. And I think that more or less finishes the engine besides, connecting the cable and fixing the last pinhole in the tank. All right, so it is the next day. I've got the engine mounted, hopefully for the last time. And I've got the belt reinstalled as well as the belt guard, and the fuel line is safely out of the way. So I went to the store and I picked up some JB Weld putty, and I was getting ready to patch this pinhole we found the other day. And unfortunately, that is not the only pinhole. Even though I drained the tank, there is still a tiny bit in there. And this morning I noticed a couple more wet spots. There's a little one up there. This whole corner is wet. And around here, actually the whole side of the tank kind of going down like that is also wet with fuel. So I think we're dealing with more problems than just one pinhole. And the concerning thing is that, this has already been patched. And right now there's virtually no fuel in it. And we have at least 3, maybe 4 leaks. So, I'm leaning towards not using this tank. So for now, I'm just going to get it removed from the engine. We'll finish up what we can and then circle back on this problem. And a couple more wet spots on the back. Anyway, I just went on eBay. I did find a new old stock tank, only about 80 bucks. So that'll be here in a week. Until then, we'll just finish it up and maybe get it started again. Now that everything's connected, we can test the throttle, the ignition, and the drive system. Never thought I'd have a use for this little screwdriver, but I think today's the day. So I'm just marking where I have the cable clamped in right now. And I don't know if you can see it, but you can just see the spring hanging down right there. So the throttle plate is in the idle position. That's full throttle. So in the idle position, the spring goes up. And if I look on the shifter column, we're also in the idle position. So like that, the cable is at its highest point. So what I'm going to do is mark the cable roughly where I need to bend it. And I'm going to put a hook on there to hook around that spring, but they'll still be interlocked when in idle. And of course, when you pull the throttle, the cable goes down and it's going to add some tension to that spring. So originally I was going to make a bracket to connect this cable to the spring, but I'm not sure I really have enough space to do that. Any bracket I make is going to be about 3/4 of an inch, maybe longer. And the throw on the cable, I don't think is going to allow that. We need to have, the max throw possible. So the hook should be fine as long as I make the bend in the right spot. So what I'm going to do is cut this a little bit long. Something like that. Doesn't have to be precise. We will have some adjustment on the cable. And with that off, we can then bend it. And I'm going to use this tool just to do that. So you can see right there, if we bend it, we might be a little bit long. So I'm going to trim just a tiny bit more off. Okay. And we're not making a Z-bend. I'm just using this to hold the cable in place. And we'll bend it as far as we can with this tool, and then probably use pliers to bend it the rest of the way. Yeah, so we'll close that up a little more. I might actually put like a screwdriver in there just to keep that from collapsing. And then we should try fitting this, and I think we'll be in business. Let's try this out. Right now we're at idle, and you can see there is a little slop in that spring. So there's no tension at all on it, but we're still locked in. So we'll bring this down. And actually that's the max throw right there. So that is max spring tension. I'm not sure what engine speed that is, but we do have tension now on the governor spring. So I think this should work. We'll try it out in a minute, as soon as we get that ignition switch connected. Well, for the ignition switch, I was going to use this right here. This is just from a 10-horse Briggs. These love to run out of oil, and as a result, I have about 3 or 4 of these switches just hanging around. The problem is there's no good place to mount the switch, and I don't want to cut any holes in here. So what I did instead was give this part to my son. He measured out the opening and he designed a part and 3D printed it. So this part will accept this switch. And it fits perfectly here, uses an existing bolt hole, and this will secure firmly in place. And then we have our switch. So I've already run some wiring. I'm going to get that connected up. We'll just tighten this down, secure the wires. Then we can make the final connections down by the engine. This blue wire that runs from the switch, it's stranded wire and it's pretty thin. So I'm going to double it up so that the crimp connector has a better chance of holding onto this little wire. Okay, and we're good. Now this is shrink tubing, so I'm going to shrink it, but I don't think it's going to actually shrink down enough to wrap around the wire. So I'm going to add also just a bit of electrical tape to help keep moisture out. Well, with the exception of the tank and maybe the air filter, we are 100% ready to go. I've got this blocked so the back wheels are off the ground. And for now, we're going to run using the external tank. So I'm going to get the engine started. Likely I'm going to have to fine tune those needles a bit. And once we have that dialed in, we'll test engaging the drive system, both forward and reverse. And assuming we're good there, then I'm going to set the engine top speed. There is an adjustment right here, and I also have the tachometer so we can measure when we get close to 3,600 RPM. Once we're there, we'll lock this in place so people can't over rev the engine, and then we'll try shutting it down using the switch. So I've got the fuel turned on. We'll turn the ignition on. And I also added actually a throttle return spring because the weight of the governor spring was holding the throttle plate open, and I'm not sure it would return to idle without a little bit of help. So like that, it should idle. Let's find out. Well, I think we're just about there. The engine continues to run just fine. The drive system works as well, both forward and reverse. And the throttle, it is responding as it should. So, I set the max speed to about 3,300 RPM. That's something we can tweak later if we need to. And the jetting, for that matter, as well. I didn't touch it this time. We are pretty close, and likely it's going to change a bit once we add that air filter. So overall, we're looking pretty good, and we're also able to shut the engine down with the ignition switch. So for the most part, I would say we're a go. I'm tempted to strap on that test tank and try it out, but I think I'll give it a few days. We'll get the proper part on there, and then we'll hit the road. So it's been a few days, and the new old stock tank arrived. And as you can probably tell, there was a slight oversight on my part. The original tank was a 3-quart tank, and the one I got is only 2 quarts. So we are losing a third of its capacity, which probably isn't going to be a huge issue, but ideally I would have gotten the same one. Anyway, this will mount onto the engine. The bolt holes align. The biggest issue I see is that this bracket right here is going to be a little bit elevated, so it might not bolt up, at least on the bottom, without some modification. But I'm not too worried about that. This one also has a drain, which is kind of a nice feature. The original didn't. So let's get this fitting out, and we'll move it over to the new tank. and we actually have to pull the plug out. We have some interference with this barb fitting. Ooh, maybe. So I found a piece of scrap metal and just drilled a few holes in it. And that should bridge the gap between the tank and this lower bracket, which probably isn't absolutely necessary, but you know, we have it, so we might as well use it. Question is, did I drill the holes in the right spot? So I've got the Tin Lizzie loaded on the trailer and the kids loaded in the car as well. Now, the plan was originally just to test this in my neighborhood, but there is a lot of car traffic and a lot of hills, and it's not really the best place to try this thing out. So instead, I'm going to haul this over to a parking lot, which should be empty more or less on the weekend. All right, so we made it to the parking lot and it is completely empty. So I've got my first son up to try it out, giving him quick instruction on how to operate this. It's very different from the normal go-kart, but I figured this would be a safe a place as any to learn. So why don't you get on in and we'll get it started. And turn that switch to on. And we'll get the fuel on. And we'll try a few pulls without choke. I think it might go. And there we go. I hear him, but I don't see him. There he is. Sounds like it's struggling a little bit at times.
Pretty cool.
It sounded like it almost stalled a few times.
Yeah, it seems to be on the turning. The sharp turning seems to be what causes it. But it can turn real quick, like real fast. Like
Interesting.
You do that, be like,
Okay, well, we'll keep an eye on it. Who wants to ride next? Okay, so the ignition is turned on. The fuel is on, although, I didn't check how much I had in the tank, but it looks like we're good. I noticed this wheel is a little bit down on air, and I actually did not bring the pump. So we're just gonna have to take it a little easy, okay? All right. You got to push it all the way down so that it locks. And that's the engine speed right there. You might need a little more. So what'd you think? Good. All right, we got one more to go. Switch is on.
Which one's throttle up and which one's throttle down?
Down is throttle up. So down is up is down.
Right. This is brake.
That's brake and that's forward and backwards.
When I pull it back, that engages it in forward?
Nope, down is forward,
Right.
and it will lock into forward. And for reverse, you have to hold it in reverse. It won't lock in reverse.
Okay.
All right?
Okay.
Okay. So you want to give it a little bit of throttle before trying to engage. There we go. take a look at that. I should have brought some tools. Sounds like it's getting too much fuel. It sounded like it was having trouble.
It is.
Okay, so let me make a small adjustment, but the engine has to be running for that.
Alright.
And can I adjust it without a tool? I think that, yeah, I guess I can. Yeah, I should be able to adjust that. It's hard to adjust because you actually have to be moving so that I can adjust it.
Oh.
So try just going, and if it sounds bad, stop, and I'll make an adjustment.
Alright.
You gotta throttle it up though. Seems a bit better. I'm going to drive it. I'm going to drive it. All right, now it is Dad's turn here. It's hard to believe that this machine was built in 1959. Just the fact that it still exists is quite amazing. Never mind running and driving. That said, though, it did take a bit of work to get it to this point. It had been disassembled 30 years ago. Somewhere along the way, the engine lost compression, but it's back together and doing what it should, and hopefully will for many more years. So I hope this video helps someone. Thanks for watching.